Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will span generations and continents, but it began in one specific place, the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog hides secrets that even history books haven't dared to record. It's the year 1863. The Civil War tears the United States apart. While bloody battles rage on the fields of Virginia and Pennsylvania, there's a man in the mountains of North Carolina who learned to use the chaos of war as cover for something much darker. His name was Nathan Crowe, and at 42 years old, he was no ordinary soldier. He wore a black cassock, carried a battered Bible, and presented himself as an itinerant priest. At that time, the Appalachians were a maze of narrow trails, deep valleys, and isolated communities. The war had completely disrupted mountain life. Entire families fled recruiters, deserters hid in the forests, and law enforcement was virtually non-existent. It was the perfect setting for someone who knew how to move in the shadows. Nathan Crowe first appeared in Watauga County records in March of that year. He arrived in the small village of Valley Crucis, bringing news of other communities, offering prayers and spiritual comfort. The people were desperate for any kind of hope. The war had taken away the young men, leaving only women, the elderly, and those who managed to escape the draft. A priest was a figure of moral authority, someone to rely on when everything else fell apart. But there was something strange about Nathan Crowe from the start. He never stayed in one place for long. He would show up in a village on Monday, conduct a service, visit a few homes, and by Thursday, he would be 3 days' ride away in another isolated village. He said his mission was to bring the divine word to those forgotten by the war, those who lived too far from established churches. Parish records from the time show that he performed weddings, baptisms, and even confessions. People confided in him their most intimate stories, their fears, their secrets, and Nathan Crowe listened patiently, jotting down names and details in a leather notebook he always kept with him. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in June of 1863. A woman named Margaret Thornton, a war widow living alone with her sister on a property near Boone, disappeared 3 days after receiving a visit from the traveling priest. Her sister Sarah reported to local authorities that Nathan Crowe had spent the entire afternoon at their home, drinking tea and discussing Margaret's generosity. He asked about the property, about their savings, and about whether they had family nearby. The morning after the disappearance, Sarah found the front door open and no sign of a struggle. Margaret's savings in a tin can under the floorboards were gone, about $230 in gold coins, a fortune for the time. Even more disturbing, the prayer book Nathan Crowe had lent Margaret was lying on the living room floor, open to a page with only one hand-scrawled sentence: "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not today." Watauga County authorities began investigating, but Nathan Crowe had already completely disappeared. No one knew his whereabouts, and descriptions of him were vague. A white man, of medium height with dark graying hair and a soft, persuasive voice. He could have been anyone. His black cassock was his only distinguishing feature, but in times of war, clothing could easily be changed. What began as an isolated case soon revealed a much more sinister pattern. When authorities began comparing reports from different counties, they discovered other strange disappearances in the mountains. Always the same profile: people alone or vulnerable, always after a visit from a traveling priest, always without signs of violence, always with savings or valuables missing, and always that same unsettling feeling that something terrible had happened, but no concrete evidence of what actually happened. We're only just beginning to descend this dark path. Nathan Crowe wasn't just a common thief. There was something methodically calculated in his actions, something that suggested a mind that perfectly understood how to exploit people's faith and desperation. Ashe County records revealed something that made investigators realize the true scale of the problem. In August of 1863, a farmer named Thomas Whitley found human belongings buried shallowly near an old camp on the banks of the New River. They weren't just clothes or personal items. They were documents, letters, and Bibles with names written on the front pages. Each item belonged to a different person. When authorities examined these objects, they discovered that many of the names corresponded to people reported missing in the previous 6 months. There was Margaret Thornton's leather wallet, the pocket watch of a merchant named Edwin Hayes, who disappeared in April after hosting a priest at his Allegheny County boarding house. A silver bracelet belonging to Dorothy Klein, who disappeared in May after confessing to an itinerant priest who was guarding her husband's life savings. 12 distinct sets of belongings. 12 people who simply ceased to exist after encountering Nathan Crowe. The pattern was now undeniable, but the victims themselves remained missing. No bodies were found in that area. Only these disturbing traces of lives cut short. What made it all even more macabre was the way Crowe chose his victims. He didn't act on impulse. Every move seemed calculated weeks in advance. Records show he visited communities multiple times before acting. On the first visit, he simply observed, talked, and gained trust. On the second, he identified potential targets. On the third, he executed his plan. One of the survivors who nearly became a victim was a man named Samuel Patterson, a war veteran who had lost his left leg in a battle near Chattanooga, Tennessee. He lived alone in a secluded cabin in the mountains near Jefferson. In September of 1863, Nathan Crowe appeared, offering prayers and companionship. Samuel, grateful for the attention, told the supposed priest about the gold coins he had saved before leaving for war. That night, Samuel awoke to a strange sound. Crowe was standing beside his bed, holding a pillow. Dim moonlight streamed in through the window, and Samuel could see the expression on the man's face. There was no emotion there. Just a cold, calculating look, like someone about to perform a routine task. Samuel fought with the remaining strength in his weakened body. He screamed, knocked over a lamp, and created enough chaos for Crowe to retreat. The false priest fled through the door, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Samuel survived, but the experience left him deeply shaken. He described Crowe to the authorities in detail, ultimately allowing them to create a more accurate portrait of the man. But there was a problem. When authorities began investigating Nathan Crowe's story, they discovered that the name was likely a fake. There were no records of any Nathan Crowe being ordained as a priest in any diocese in the region. No church recognized him. No religious institution had any documentation about him. Who was this man really? Where did he come from? Investigators began reviewing old cases from other regions, looking for similar patterns, and they found them. In 1858, in Kentucky, there were reports of an itinerant preacher involved in disappearances. In 1860, in Tennessee, the same story. Always in rural areas, always during periods of social unrest, always exploiting people's faith. The Civil War had given him the perfect cover. With thousands of people dying, disappearing, and fleeing, it was easy for someone like Crowe to operate without arousing immediate suspicion. He understood that in times of chaos, people desperately search for something to believe in, and he turned this fundamental human need into a weapon. Local newspapers began publishing warnings. The Watauga Democrat alerted communities to the fake priest, describing his modus operandi and asking anyone with information to contact authorities. But Nathan Crowe had already moved on to another area. He was like smoke in the mountains, unstoppable, always one step ahead. What authorities didn't yet know was that Crowe had a method for disposing of evidence that was nearly perfect for that time and place. The Appalachian mountains were filled with deep caves, inaccessible canyons, and swift-flowing rivers that held secrets forever. He knew the land better than any researcher. And we're still just scratching the surface of this dark story. The autumn of 1863 brought an unexpected twist to the investigation. A Wilkes County sheriff named Robert Hendricks received an anonymous letter that would completely change the direction of the search. The letter was written in polite, almost elegant handwriting and contained detailed information about Nathan Crowe's movements. It described specific places he had been, precise dates, and even conversations he had had with people in the villages. What intrigued Hendricks was the tone of the letter. It wasn't written by someone trying to bring justice out of a sense of duty. It was personal. There was anger in every word, as if the author knew Crowe intimately and had somehow been betrayed by him. The letter ended with a cryptic sentence. "Look in Bristol, Tennessee. He's back where it all began." Hendricks traveled to Bristol, a town straddling the Tennessee-Virginia border, nestled in the heart of the Appalachians. There, he discovered something no one expected. Nathan Crowe had a story, a real story, with records from people who knew him before he became the wandering ghost of the mountains. 20 years earlier, in 1843, there was a man named Nathaniel Crowley who worked as a clerk in a law firm in Bristol. He was married, lived a seemingly normal life, and attended the local church. But in 1846, his wife died under circumstances that have never been fully understood. She was found at the base of a cliff near their home. Authorities ruled it an accident, But rumors in the community swirled that the marriage was unhappy, that Nathaniel had become increasingly controlling and manipulative. After his wife's death, Nathaniel Crowley sold everything he owned and disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, but now, connecting the dates and details, it became clear that Nathaniel Crowley and Nathan Crowe were the same person. He had shortened his surname, assumed a new identity, and started a completely different life in the shadows of the mountains. What had transformed an ordinary clerk into a methodically calculated predator? Hendricks spoke to elderly people in Bristol who still remembered Nathaniel. They described him as an intelligent, articulate man, but with something deeply flawed in his nature. He never displayed genuine emotion. His social interactions seemed rehearsed, as if he were always playing a role. One witness, a woman named Elizabeth Morrow, who had been a neighbor of the Crowleys, recounted something disturbing. She said Nathaniel had a habit of observing people, studying their behavior. He would ask subtle, seemingly innocent questions that revealed intimate information about their lives, and he had an uncanny ability to make people trust him instantly. This information was crucial. It showed that Nathan Crowe was not simply an opportunistic criminal exploiting the chaos of war. He was someone who had cultivated these skills for decades. The persona of the itinerant priest was just the latest of his masks, chosen because it was perfect for gaining access to people's homes and trusts in times of war. But the anonymous letter had promised that Crowe would return to Bristol. Why? What could possibly bring him back to the place where his old life had ended? Hendricks decided the best strategy was to wait. He kept a discreet watch on the city, especially around the former Crowley family estates. Meanwhile, more details about Crowe's methods emerged from other investigations. A merchant in Asheville, North Carolina, reported selling unusual quantities of quicklime to a man matching Crowe's description earlier that year. Quicklime was used for a variety of legitimate purposes, but it also had a more sinister use than any experienced researcher knew. Another account came from a blacksmith in Mitchell County. He recalled repairing digging tools for a man dressed as a preacher. The customer paid well and asked that the work be done discreetly. The blacksmith didn't think much of it at the time, but now the details came back to him with a completely different meaning. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming an increasingly disturbing picture. Nathan Crowe didn't just rob his victims, he meticulously planned how to make them disappear completely. He studied the terrain, prepared secluded locations in advance, and ensured there would be no traces that could lead back to him. And most frightening of all, he was becoming bolder. The intervals between his acts were decreasing. In March and April, he had waited weeks between each incident. By August and September, the intervals were only days. It was as if he were developing a compulsion, or perhaps simply losing his fear of capture. We are now at the center of one of the most intense investigations the Appalachian Mountains have ever seen, but Nathan Crowe still remained one step ahead, moving along trails known only to him. October of 1863 arrived, bringing the first frosts to the mountains. The leaves turned red and gold, and the trails became more difficult to navigate. For most people, it was time to prepare for the harsh Appalachian winter. But for Nathan Crowe, it was time to make what would be his most significant mistake. A group of hunters found something disturbing in a remote ravine near Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina. It was a hastily abandoned campsite. There was a still smoldering campfire, provisions scattered across the ground, and clear signs that someone had left the site in a hurry. But what really caught their attention was what they found buried shallowly just a few feet away. Documents, dozens of them. Wills, property deeds, personal letters, all belonging to different people. Many of the names corresponded to Crowe's known victims, but there were also documents for people who hadn't even been reported missing yet. This meant the true number of victims was far higher than anyone had imagined. Among the papers, investigators found something even more revealing: a diary. It wasn't an ordinary journal, filled with personal reflections or feelings. It was a methodical, almost businesslike record. Crowe kept notes on each person he considered a potential target. There were descriptions of their routines, their vulnerabilities, the estimated value of their assets. He ranked people by level of difficulty, as if he were planning business deals rather than crimes. An entry dated July 1863 read, "The widow near Boone keeps considerable savings. She lives alone with her sister, but the sister occasionally travels to visit relatives. A suitable moment will soon present itself." This was clearly a reference to Margaret Thornton, who disappeared under exactly the circumstances described. But there was something else in the diary that left investigators deeply uneasy. Crowe wrote about his actions with clinical coolness, but there were occasional passages where he reflected on his own behavior. In one entry he wrote, "I don't feel what others feel. I watch their tears like one watches rain through a window. That makes me different, but not necessarily wrong, just different." These reflections revealed a mind that worked fundamentally differently from most people. Crowe understood intellectually that his actions caused suffering, but he was incapable of genuine empathy. For him, people were resources to be exploited, problems to be solved. The priest's cassock was not just a practical disguise, it was a fascinating experiment in human manipulation. Sheriff Hendricks realized they needed to think differently to capture someone like Crowe. Conventional investigative methods wouldn't work against someone so meticulous and adaptable. He decided to use Crowe's own notes against him. If Crowe studied people's vulnerabilities, then they would study Crowe's vulnerabilities. Analyzing the journal, Hendricks noticed an interesting pattern. Crowe always returned to specific areas of the mountains. There were locations he repeatedly mentioned as landmarks, places where he felt safe. One such location was an ancient cave near the Watauga River, described in his notes as a reliable refuge when needed. Authorities mounted a low-key operation. Rather than actively searching for Crowe on the trails, which would certainly alert him, they decided to observe these refugees. Small teams of experienced mountain men were formed, people who knew the territory as well as Crowe. They positioned themselves strategically, maintaining silent surveillance. Meanwhile, the anonymous letter Hendricks had received continued to intrigue investigators. Who would have access to such detailed information about Crowe? Who would know him intimately enough to predict his movements? The handwriting was polite, suggesting someone with a formal education, and the tone of the letter, that restrained anger, hinted at a personal betrayal. One of Hendricks's aides, a young congressman named William Foster, proposed an intriguing theory. What if the letter's author was someone who had worked with Crowe at one point? Someone who might have been an accomplice, but later turned against him for some reason. Or perhaps someone Crowe had tried to victimize, but managed to escape, and now sought revenge. The theory gained traction when new information arrived from Bristol. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrow, the Crowleys' former neighbor, remembered something important. Nathaniel Crowley had a younger brother named Jacob. The two were close, but had a violent falling out soon after Nathaniel's wife's death. Jacob disappeared from Bristol around the same time as Nathaniel, and no one ever knew what happened to him. Could Jacob Crowley be alive? Could he know the truth about what his brother had become? And most importantly, was he the author of the anonymous letter? If so, his motivations were complex. Did he want justice, or was there something more personal at play? Temperatures continued to drop in the mountains. Soon it would be impossible to move easily along the snow-covered trails. Nathan Crowe would need to find a place to spend the winter, a more permanent refuge, and investigators were betting that this would be the moment he would make his fatal mistake. Even the most calculating minds have limits, and we're about to see how even someone as meticulous as Nathan Crowe can fail. November brought the first heavy snowfalls to the Appalachians. Trails turned into dangerous white mazes, and isolated communities grew even more distant from one another. This was the time of year when people would retreat to their homes, burn wood constantly, and wait for spring to arrive. But for researchers strategically positioned in the mountains, the vigil continued. It was on a particularly cold night, November 12th, that the first confirmed sighting of Nathan Crowe in weeks occurred. One of the surveillance parties, positioned near the cave mentioned in the diary, saw smoke rising from a crevice in the rocks. It was too late for it to be an ordinary traveler's camp. Whoever was there was preparing to stay for an extended period. The leader of that group, an experienced tracker named Daniel McCoy, made a crucial decision. Instead of acting immediately, he held his position and observed. Crowe was too smart to be captured in a rash attack. It was better to confirm it was really him and understand what he was doing there. For 3 days, McCoy's team maintained a discreet watch. They saw a man matching Crowe's description, occasionally emerging from the cave to fetch water from the river or hunt small game. He was cautious, always checking his surroundings before exposing himself. But there was something different about him now. His movement seemed more nervous, less confident. It was as if he knew the noose was closing in. On the 3rd day of observation, something unexpected happened. Another man appeared in the area. He arrived on foot, alone, following a trail from the direction of Bristol. As he approached the cave, Crowe went out to meet him. The two men stood talking outside, but they were too far away for the surveillance team to hear them. The conversation was tense. Even from a distance, it was clear they were having a conflict. The visitor was gesturing angrily, pointing his finger at Crowe, who remained strangely quiet. After about 20 minutes, the visitor turned and began walking back down the trail. Crowe stood still, watching him go, before returning to the cave. McCoy made a quick decision. He sent 2 of his men to discreetly follow the visitor, while he and the rest of the team continued to watch Crowe. Finding out who this man was could be as important as capturing Crowe himself. The men followed the visitor for nearly 2 days of trekking through the mountains. He traveled with purpose, knew the trails well, and seemed to be heading somewhere specific. Finally, he reached a small, isolated cabin near Shady Valley, Tennessee. There, the trackers were able to identify him through a distant neighbor. His name was Jacob Crowley. Confirmation that Nathan's brother was alive and apparently in contact with him completely changed the course of the investigation. Sheriff Hendricks personally traveled to Shady Valley to confront Jacob. The meeting took place in the simple cabin where Jacob had apparently lived alone for years. Jacob Crowley was a man in his 50s, with a tired appearance and eyes that carried the weight of many secrets. When Hendricks identified himself and explained the purpose of his visit, Jacob showed no surprise. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He invited the sheriff in, served hot coffee, and began to tell a story no one was prepared to hear. Jacob explained that he and Nathaniel had been close in their youth, but he always knew there was something deeply wrong with his older brother. Nathaniel was incapable of forming genuine emotional connections with people. He saw others as pawns in a game, tools to achieve his goals. When they were still young, Jacob witnessed Nathaniel manipulate people without remorse, lie with frightening ease, and harm others for his own benefit. The situation became unbearable when Nathaniel's wife died. Jacob always believed it wasn't an accident. He tried to convince the authorities to investigate further, but there wasn't enough evidence. Nathaniel sensed his brother's suspicions and threatened him. Jacob fled Bristol, temporarily changed his name, and tried to rebuild a life away from that nightmare, but he never truly escaped. In the years that followed, Jacob occasionally heard rumors about a traveling preacher caught up in strange circumstances. He recognized the patterns, the modus operandi. He knew it was Nathaniel continuing what had always been his true nature. Jacob struggled with himself for years, torn between family loyalty and the knowledge of the harm his brother caused. Finally, he decided he had to do something. He was the one who sent the anonymous letter to Sheriff Hendricks, and he was the one who recently sought out Nathaniel in the mountains to make a final attempt to convince him to turn himself in. The conversation the trackers had witnessed was exactly that. One brother begging the other to stop, to accept responsibility for his actions. Nathaniel refused. He told Jacob he saw no reason to stop, that he was simply living according to his nature. That society's rules didn't apply to people like him, who could see beyond conventional morality. It was at that moment that Jacob realized his brother was completely lost, that there was no salvation for someone so fundamentally disconnected from humanity. Hendricks listened in silence. When Jacob finished, the sheriff made a proposal. He needed Jacob's help to safely capture Nathaniel. Jacob knew his brother better than anyone. He could predict how Nathaniel would react, where he might try to escape, what strategies he would use to escape. Jacob agreed, but made one request. He wanted to be present when Nathaniel was captured, not out of revenge, but because he felt he owed it to the victims. Someone from the Crowley family needed to witness the end of this terrible story, needed to look Nathaniel in the eye and let him know that his crimes would not be forgotten. Preparations for the capture began immediately. We are approaching the crucial moment in this dark story. The plan was crafted with surgical precision over 2 full days. Jacob provided crucial information about his brother's behavior, details that only decades of close contact could reveal. Nathaniel had certain quirks, certain rituals he followed religiously. Every morning before dawn, he would leave the cave to watch the sunrise from a specific spot on the rocks above. It was a moment of vulnerability, a brief period when he let his guard down. The team expanded to include 12 experienced men, all familiar with the mountainous terrain and accustomed to moving silently. Sheriff Hendricks divided the group into 3 units. The first would surround the cave from behind, blocking any escape route into the mountains. The second would position itself along the river, cutting off access to water and the trails that followed the valley. The third, led by Hendricks himself and including Jacob, would wait at the spot where Nathaniel usually watched the sunrise. On the night of November 15th, the men took up positions. The temperature had dropped dramatically, dropping well below freezing. The sky was clear, filled with stars, and the crescent moon provided enough light to see the silhouettes of trees against the snow. Each man knew he had to remain completely still and silent. Any strange sound would alert Crowe, and he would vanish into the mountains like a ghost. The hours before dawn were the longest. The cold penetrated clothes, froze fingers, and made every breath visible in the frigid air, but no one moved. They waited with the patience of seasoned hunters, knowing the right moment would eventually come. As the first light began to brighten the horizon, the makeshift cave door opened. Nathaniel Crowe emerged, wrapped in a heavy coat and carrying his battered Bible under his arm. He paused for a moment, surveyed his surroundings with a watchful eye, then began climbing the rocky path that led to his favorite vantage point. Hendricks grabbed Jacob's arm, signaling him to wait. They needed to let Nathaniel reach the top where there would be nowhere to run. The sun was just beginning to peek over the distant horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. It was a scene of extraordinary beauty, a disturbing contrast to the tension of the moment. Nathaniel reached the top of the rock formation and stood there, gazing at the sunrise. He opened the Bible to a specific page, but he wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, and for a brief moment there was something almost human in his expression. Perhaps it was nostalgia, or perhaps simply the aesthetic appreciation of a beautiful moment. It was impossible to know what was going through this man's mind. It was then that Hendricks gave the signal. Men emerged from their positions on all sides simultaneously. Nathaniel realized too late. He turned sharply, looking for an escape route, but he was completely surrounded. His options were over. He could try to run and be surely captured, or he could surrender peacefully. For a moment that seemed like an eternity. Nathaniel stood completely still. His eyes roamed the faces of the men surrounding him, calculating probabilities, weighing possibilities. Then his gaze found Jacob, and something changed in his expression. It wasn't fear nor anger. It was almost curiosity, as if he were genuinely interested in understanding why his brother had done what he had done. Jacob stepped forward, standing just a few feet from Nathaniel. The two brothers stared at each other in silence. After all those years, all those deaths, all those destroyed lives, they were finally face to face again. Jacob was the first to break the silence. He didn't shout. He didn't make dramatic accusations. His voice was low, weary, and filled with deep sadness. He told Nathaniel that this had to end, that the people he had destroyed deserved the truth to be known, that the families still searching for their loved ones deserved answers. Nathaniel listened to everything with that characteristic neutral expression. When Jacob finished, he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost polite. He said he understood what Jacob was trying to do, but that Jacob had never truly understood him. He explained with frightening coldness that he felt no remorse because he genuinely couldn't understand why he should. To him, people were simply resources. His actions were no different from someone picking apples from a tree or fishing in a river. It was at that moment that everyone present truly understood who they were dealing with. This was not a man consumed by evil in the traditional sense. This was someone whose mind worked fundamentally differently, someone incapable of processing empathy or basic human connection. The priest's cassock, the prayers, the performance of piety, all of it was merely a mechanism, a tool developed through observation and practice. Hendricks ordered Nathaniel handcuffed. He didn't resist. He allowed the shackles to be placed on his wrists with the same indifference one might allow one's height to be measured. As he was led down the trail back to the valley, he continued to hold the Bible under his arm. When one of the deputies tried to take it, Nathaniel politely asked to keep it. Hendricks allowed it as long as they checked to make sure nothing dangerous was hidden between the pages. The descent from the mountains took all day. Nathaniel didn't try to escape, didn't cause any trouble. He walked calmly, occasionally commenting on the weather or making observations about the terrain. It was as if he were on a casual stroll, not being taken to face charges of horrific crimes. This forced normalcy was more disturbing than any display of violence or desperation could have been. When they finally arrived in the town of Boone at dusk, a small crowd was already waiting. News of the capture had spread quickly through the communities. There were faces of the victims' families, people who had lost loved ones and never known what had happened to them. There was anger in those eyes, but also something deeper, a desperate need to understand, to find some kind of meaning in the absurdity of this tragedy. Nathaniel Crowe was taken to the county jail. a small but solid structure built of stone. He was placed in the most secure cell, and guards were stationed in constant shifts. No one wanted to risk him finding some way to escape. The story was far from over, but at least that chapter had come to an end. The days following the capture were marked by growing tension throughout the region. The news spread like wildfire through the mountains, reaching isolated villages and farms where families had lost loved ones without ever knowing what had happened. Truckloads began arriving in Boone, bringing people from neighboring counties, all eager to see for themselves the man who had hidden behind the black cassock. Sheriff Hendricks organized interrogations that began the morning after the arrest. He assembled a small team including Jacob Crowley, 2 county magistrates, and a clerk to document every word spoken. Nathaniel was brought into a simple room, still handcuffed and seated in a wooden chair. He maintained that same unsettling calm, as if he were about to discuss ordinary business and not answer for destroyed lives. Hendricks began with direct questions. How many people had Nathaniel victimized? Where were the bodies? What were the names of those never reported missing? Nathaniel answered some questions with clinical precision, but declined others, claiming he couldn't remember specific details. He treated everything as a matter of administrative record, not human lives. One of the most shocking revelations came when Nathaniel admitted to keeping detailed notes not only about his potential victims, but also about the locations where he had left evidence. He explained with cold logic that he needed to keep records to avoid mistakes. In his twisted mind, this was simply good organization. He revealed that he kept another notebook hidden in a specific location in the woods, containing information about cases that had not yet been discovered. A team was immediately dispatched to retrieve this notebook. They found it exactly where Nathaniel said it would be, buried in a metal box beneath a marked tree near the Doe River in Tennessee. The contents were even more disturbing than the previously found diary. It contained entries on 27 different people, 27 lives Nathaniel had studied, plotted against, and eventually eliminated. Among these notes were cases that authorities didn't even know were connected. A merchant who disappeared on a trip between cities in 1861. A teacher who left her school one afternoon and was never seen again in 1862. A war veteran who set out to visit family and simply vanished along the way. They had all crossed paths with Nathaniel Crowe at some point, and they all paid the ultimate price for trusting the man in the black robe. During the interrogations, Jacob sat silently, observing his brother. At one point, Hendricks allowed Jacob to ask questions directly. What Jacob wanted to know wasn't about the crime specifically, but about when it all began. When did Nathaniel realize he was different from other people? When did he decide to use that difference to harm others? Nathaniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said he always knew he was different. Even when he was young, he realized that other people's emotions were mysterious to him. He saw people crying and didn't understand why. He saw people connecting, forming friendships, falling in love, and it all seemed completely artificial to him, like actors performing on a stage. He learned to mimic these emotions by carefully observing. He discovered that if he said certain words, made certain facial expressions, people responded in predictable ways. It was like learning the rules of a game, and when he realized he could manipulate people's emotions to his own advantage, it simply became a skill to be refined. Regarding the first time he took a life, Nathaniel was vague. He only said it happened a long time ago, before he was even married. It had been almost accidental, a situation that spiraled out of control, but after it happened, he realized something important. He felt nothing. No horror, no guilt, no regret. Just a clinical curiosity about what he had done. And it was in that moment that he fully understood his true nature. The magistrates present were visibly shaken by these revelations. It was one thing to confront criminals motivated by anger, greed, or desperation. It was quite another to be faced with someone who treated human lives as mathematical problems to be solved. One of the magistrates, an elderly man named Thomas Garrett, asked a question that was on everyone's mind. Was there anything Nathaniel truly valued? Was there anything that mattered to him? Nathaniel thought for a moment and responded with disconcerting honesty. He said he valued his freedom, his ability to move freely and do what he wanted. He valued his intelligence, his ability to solve complex problems, and strangely, he said he valued the Bible he carried, not for religious reasons, but because it was an object perfectly designed for his purposes. It was respected, opening doors. It was portable, easy to carry, and no one suspected a man carrying a Bible. That answer revealed more about Nathaniel Crowe than anything else. Even sacred objects, symbols of faith and hope for millions, were mere tools to him. There was nothing genuine about their existence, no real connection to any aspect of normal human experience. As the interrogations continued, authorities worked to locate the locations Nathaniel had described in his notes. It was slow and difficult work. The mountains were vast, and winter made many areas completely inaccessible. But they did find some places. Caves where belongings were hidden. Ravines where the earth showed signs of disturbance. Each discovery confirmed Nathaniel's confessions and added weight to the charges he would face. The victims' families began arriving to give statements. Each story was a painful reminder of the real impact of Nathaniel's actions. A daughter who never knew her father because he disappeared before she was born. A son who spent decades searching for his mother, never able to accept that she had simply left without a trace. Siblings, friends, neighbors, all bearing the weight of unexplained losses that were finally beginning to make sense. The most disturbing thing was realizing how many of these people had known Nathaniel personally. He had shared meals with them, prayed in their homes, offered words of comfort during the war, and all the while he was simply assessing, calculating, biding his time. The betrayal of trust was almost as painful as the losses themselves. The justice system needed to decide how to proceed. This was no simple case. The number of victims was extraordinary, the premeditation was undeniable, and the complete lack of remorse made it impossible to argue any mitigating circumstances. Formal charges were being prepared, and everyone knew that Nathaniel Crowe's trial would be one of the most significant the region had ever seen. December arrived, bringing constant snow and bitter cold to the Appalachians. The prison in Boone became the center of attention, not only in the region, but also from distant parts of the country. Journalists from cities like Richmond, Charleston, and even as far away as Philadelphia began arriving, drawn by the extraordinary nature of the case. Stories about the phony priest who had preyed on lonely travelers during the war spread through telegrams and newspaper articles. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a seasoned lawyer named Harrison Blackwell, who had served briefly in the Union Army before returning to law practice. He spent weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every deposition, every page of Nathaniel's notebooks. The task was monumental. Never before in that region had anyone faced charges of such magnitude. Blackwell decided to initially focus on 5 specific cases where the evidence was absolutely irrefutable. Margaret Thornton, the widow who disappeared after receiving a visit from Nathaniel in June. Edwin Hayes, the merchant who hosted the false priest and was never seen again. Dorothy Klein, whose belongings were found in the abandoned camp. Samuel Patterson, who survived the attempt and could testify directly, and Thomas Whitley, the farmer who found the buried belongings and initiated the broader investigation. The trial was scheduled to begin on January 8, 1864. The date was strategically chosen, allowing sufficient time to adequately prepare the case while maintaining the momentum of public interest. The county courthouse had to be temporarily expanded to accommodate the expected crowds. Extra benches were installed, and additional guards were brought in to maintain order. Nathaniel needed legal representation, as mandated by law. Finding a lawyer willing to defend him was surprisingly difficult. Many refused outright, either out of moral principle or out of fear of being publicly associated with such heinous crimes. Finally, a young lawyer named Marcus Webb agreed to take on the defense. Webb had no illusions about his client's guilt, but he genuinely believed that everyone deserved adequate representation in court. During preparatory meetings with his lawyer, Nathaniel showed little interest in building a real defense. When Webb attempted to explore possible arguments about sanity, Nathaniel flatly refused. He insisted that he was perfectly sane, that he fully understood his actions and their consequences. He simply didn't agree that he should be punished for them. In his view, he had operated within his own internal logic, and society was wrong to judge him for being different. Webb found himself in an impossible position. His client essentially refused to allow any meaningful defense. The best strategy Webb could develop was to question the quality of some evidence and attempt to create reasonable doubt about the full extent of the crimes. There was no denying that Nathaniel had committed criminal acts, but perhaps it would be possible to avoid the most serious charges. Meanwhile, Jacob Crowley remained in Boone, staying at a modest boarding house. He had become a strange figure in town, simultaneously respected for his role in the capture, and viewed with suspicion for being the accused's brother. Some people greeted him politely on the street. Others looked away. Jacob carried this burden with quiet dignity, understanding that he was paying in a way for his brother's sins. One night, Jacob received an unexpected visitor at the boarding house. It was an elderly woman named Catherine Hayes, sister of Edwin, the missing merchant. She had traveled dangerous trails in the dead of winter just to speak with Jacob. She wanted to understand. How had one family produced two such different people? How could one brother be moral and conscientious while the other was capable of such cruelty? Jacob invited Catherine to sit down and talked with her for hours. He explained that he didn't have complete answers. He and Nathaniel had grown up in the same house with the same parents, exposed to the same influences. But from an early age, Nathaniel was different. Not in obvious ways that would immediately catch your eye, but in subtleties that accumulated. The way he manipulated situations to his advantage, the lack of genuine emotional connection, the ability to lie without any sign of discomfort. Catherine listened to everything and then asked a question that would stay with Jacob for the rest of his life. She asked if he thought he could have done anything differently, if there was a moment when intervention could have changed the course of Nathaniel's life. Jacob answered honestly that he didn't know. He had tried many times when they were younger to help his brother understand empathy and human connection, but it was like trying to teach colors to someone born blind. Nathaniel simply didn't have the internal mechanisms necessary to process emotions the way others did. The conversation between Jacob and Catherine represented something important. It was one of the victim's families finding humanity in the perpetrator's family, acknowledging that Jacob was also, in a sense, a victim of Nathaniel's actions. Catherine left that night with a little more peace than she had when she arrived. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding. In the days leading up to the trial, the atmosphere in Boone grew increasingly tense. There were constant arguments in taverns, churches, and stores. Some argued that Nathaniel should be executed immediately, without the need for a formal trial. Others insisted that the law should take its proper course, that civilization meant justice through established processes, not summary revenge. Sheriff Hendricks maintained constant guards at the jail, concerned about the possibility of a mob attempting to take justice into its own hands. He understood the people's anger, but he also knew that allowing mob violence would be a betrayal of the principles that separated civilized society from chaos. Nathaniel Crowe had operated outside the rules of civilization. Society's response needed to demonstrate that those rules still mattered. On the eve of the trial, Nathaniel asked to see Jacob one last time. Sheriff Hendricks allowed it, but insisted on being present during the conversation. The two brothers sat on opposite sides of a table in the cell, separated by chains and by chasms far deeper than iron could represent. Nathaniel said he wanted to thank Jacob for finally taking a stand. He explained, in his peculiarly disconnected way, that he appreciated Jacob's consistency. His brother had stood by his principles even when it was difficult, even when it meant betraying family ties. Nathaniel said he respected that. In the limited way he was capable of respecting anything. Jacob replied that he didn't want Nathaniel's thanks. He wanted his brother to understand, even if only intellectually, the suffering he had caused. Nathaniel listened and then calmly admitted that he would never be able to fully understand. It was a fundamental limitation of his nature, but he could objectively recognize that his actions had caused pain to others, even if he couldn't feel that pain himself. It was a strange and deeply sad conversation. Two brothers speaking through a void that could never be bridged. When it was over, Jacob left the prison knowing it would be the last meaningful conversation he would have with Nathaniel. The trial would begin tomorrow, and after that, there would be nothing more to say. January 8, 1864 dawned cold and clear. The streets of Boone were covered in a fresh layer of snow that reflected the pale winter sun. People began gathering in front of the courthouse hours before the scheduled opening, some traveling for days across the frozen mountains just to witness this historic moment. The air was charged with an almost palpable tension, a mixture of anticipation, anger, and the need for justice. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the courthouse doors opened. The crowd entered in an orderly fashion, guided by guards who maintained strict control lines. The interior of the courtroom had been meticulously prepared. Polished benches, an American flag hanging behind the judge's desk, and an atmosphere of solemnity that contrasted sharply with the somber nature of the case that would be heard there. The appointed judge was a man named Silas Montgomery, known for his firmness but also for his strict adherence to legal procedure. Montgomery had served as a judge for 16 years and had seen many difficult cases, but nothing compared to the complexity and magnitude of what he would face in the coming days. He entered the courtroom with a serious expression, and everyone stood in respect. Nathaniel Crowe was brought in chains. He was still dressed in simple clothes, but his black cassock had been confiscated as evidence. Without that symbol of false piety, he seemed smaller somehow, more ordinary. But his eyes remained the same, cold and calculating, scanning every face in the room as if cataloguing information for future use. He sat next to his lawyer, Marcus Webb, showing no visible nervousness. Prosecutor Blackwell opened the case with a powerful speech that captured the attention of everyone present. He used no sensational or sensational language. Instead, he presented the facts clearly and methodically. He described how Nathaniel Crowe had systematically exploited people's faith during a time of war and chaos, how he had studied his victims with the same attention a predator studies its prey, how he had used the priest's robe not out of religious belief, but as a calculated tool of manipulation. Blackwell then presented the physical evidence. Nathaniel's notebooks were displayed to the jury, their pages filled with meticulous notes about people who eventually disappeared. Victims' belongings were displayed, each item representing a life cut short. Maps of the mountains were presented, marking the locations where evidence had been found. It was an overwhelming accumulation of evidence that painted an undeniable picture of premeditated and systematic crimes. The first testimony came from Samuel Patterson, the veteran who had survived Nathaniel's attempt on his life. Samuel walked to the dais with difficulty, leaning on a cane to compensate for the leg he lost in the war. He looked directly at Nathaniel as he was sworn in, and for the first time, something crossed Nathaniel's expression. It wasn't fear or shame, but something close to curiosity, as if he were genuinely interested in hearing the perspective of someone who had escaped. Samuel described that night in vivid detail, how he had trusted the man who introduced himself as a priest, how he had shared his vulnerabilities and fears, and how he had woken to find that same man about to take his life. His voice trembled as he described the expression on Nathaniel's face at that moment. There was no anger, no passion, only a mechanical coldness that was more terrifying than any violent emotion could have been. During Samuel's testimony, Attorney Webb tried to question details, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding in the darkness of the night. But Samuel was adamant. He knew exactly what he saw, exactly what was about to happen, and only his desperate resistance had saved his life. The jury drank in every word, their faces reflecting the gravity of what they were hearing. The next testimony came from Sarah Thornton, sister of Margaret, the widow who disappeared in June. Sarah described how Nathaniel had gained their trust through gentle conversations and comforting prayers, how he had casually asked about their savings, their plans, and whether they had family nearby, questions that seemed innocent at the time, but now revealed their true purpose. When Sarah found the abandoned prayer book with that ominous handwritten phrase, she knew immediately that something terrible had happened. Sarah wept as she testified, and several people in the courtroom wept with her. But Nathaniel remained impassive, watching the testimony with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the trial. His complete lack of reaction was unsettling to everyone testifying. It was as if he were watching a play that didn't involve him personally. Thomas Whitley, the farmer who discovered the buried belongings, testified about the shocking moment of his discovery. He described how he was hunting near the New River when his dog began digging near an abandoned campsite. What he found changed his life. They were traces of human lives, carefully buried, as if they were just trash to be discarded. The experience has haunted him ever since, knowing he had been just feet away from evidence of horrific crimes without realizing it. The most emotionally difficult testimony came from Catherine Hayes, sister of Edwin, the missing merchant. Catherine was an elderly and frail woman, but her voice was firm as she described her brother. Edwin was a good man, she said, who had worked hard all his life to build an honest small business. He was known for his generosity, always willing to offer lodging to travelers in need. This same kindness had become his final vulnerability when he encountered Nathaniel Crowe. Catherine didn't ask for revenge in her testimony. Instead, she asked for something deeper. She asked the court to recognize her brother's humanity, to not allow him to be just another name on a list of victims. Edwin had a story. He had friends. He had dreams that would never come true. His disappearance left a hole in the community that would never be completely filled. Over the course of 3 days, witness after witness presented their stories. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of devastation Nathaniel had left across the mountains. And through it all, Nathaniel himself remained silent, refusing to testify in his own defense. Webb had advised against it, knowing that any word Nathaniel said would likely only solidify his conviction. Finally, the time for closing arguments arrived. Blackwell was direct and powerful, arguing that Nathaniel Crowe posed a unique danger to society. He was not a man who had committed crimes in a moment of passion or desperation. He was someone who had systematically planned and executed acts against innocent people, using their faith as a weapon against them. The premeditation was undeniable. The lack of remorse was complete, and the need for justice was absolute. Webb did his best with an impossible defense. He argued that while the crimes were real and horrific, the court needed to consider whether Nathaniel was truly capable of understanding the morality of his actions in the same way an ordinary person does. Perhaps there was something fundamentally different about his mental makeup, something that wasn't his fault. But even Webb didn't seem to fully believe his own arguments. The law was clear, and the evidence was overwhelming. Judge Montgomery gave the jury final instructions. He emphasized that they should base their verdict solely on the evidence presented, not on emotion or prejudice. But he also made it clear that the gravity of the crimes could not be ignored. The jury retired to deliberate, and the courtroom entered a tense waiting period. The jury deliberated for a full 6 hours. 6 hours during which the courtroom remained tensely silent, with people waiting in the pews or in the aisles, talking in whispers about the possible verdict. Winter had brought an early darkness, and oil lamps were lit in the courtroom, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Jacob Crowley sat alone in a corner, lost in thoughts no one could fully fathom. When the jury finally returned, the silence in the courtroom became absolute. The jury foreman, a respected farmer named Henry Morrison, stood with a paper trembling slightly in his hands. Judge Montgomery asked if they had reached a verdict. Morrison replied yes. His voice was low but firm as he uttered the words everyone expected, guilty on all counts. There was no outpouring of emotion in the room. No one shouted or applauded. Instead, there was just a collective sigh, as if hundreds of people had simultaneously held their breath and were finally able to release it. It was relief, but also sadness. Guilty meant the crimes were real, that those lives had truly been lost in the most horrific way possible. Nathaniel Crowe received the verdict without any change in expression. He simply nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. There was no surprise in his eyes, no visible disappointment. It was as if the verdict were just another piece of information to be processed, not a judgment on his own life and freedom. Judge Montgomery scheduled the formal sentencing for the following day, allowing time to prepare the appropriate documentation. Nathaniel was taken back to his cell under heavy guard. The crowd began to slowly disperse, spilling out into the cold streets, where the snow had begun to fall again. Conversations were restrained, reflective. There was justice in that verdict, but also a terrible weight in the recognition of how much darkness a single human being could carry. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his room in the boarding house watching the snow fall on the silent city. He thought of his brother, of how two people with the same blood could be so fundamentally different. He thought of the victims, of how many lives had been cut short by choices Nathaniel had made so callously. And he thought of himself, of how he would carry that familiar weight for the rest of his days. The next morning, the court reconvened. Judge Montgomery entered with a grave expression, carrying documents that sealed Nathaniel Crowe's fate. He began his statement by acknowledging the unique gravity of the case. He explained that in his 16 years as a judge, he had never faced anything that so profoundly tested the limits of the law and human understanding. Montgomery spoke about the premeditated nature of the crimes, the systematic abuse of trust, the calculated exploitation of faith during a time of national vulnerability. He mentioned each victim by name, acknowledging their individualities, their stories, and the hole their absences left in communities. These weren't just numbers or statistics. These were people who deserved to be remembered. Then he pronounced the sentence. Nathaniel Crowe would be hanged by the neck. The execution would take place in 30 days on February 13, 1864, allowing time for any formal appeals the defense might wish to file. Montgomery emphasized that he had made this decision not out of revenge, but because the magnitude of the crimes and the complete lack of remorse left no reasonable alternative. Nathaniel listened to the sentencing with the same unsettling calm he had displayed throughout the trial. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words were etched in the memory of all who heard them. He said he understood the sentence, that he recognized that society needed to protect its members from people like him, but he also said something that sent a chill through the room. He stated that he didn't regret his actions because regret requires empathy, and he simply didn't possess that capacity. He was who he was, and no amount of punishment would change that. His only regret was being caught, not the crimes themselves. That final admission solidified what many already suspected. Nathaniel Crowe was not someone who could be redeemed or rehabilitated. There was no transformation possible because there was no emotional foundation on which to build change. He was, in Judge Montgomery's own words, an anomaly of human nature, someone born without the internal mechanisms that connect people to one another. The 30 days between his sentencing and his scheduled execution were strange and dark. Nathaniel remained in prison, receiving occasional visitors. Some came out of morbid curiosity, wanting to see the man who had caused so much suffering. Others came for more complex reasons. There was a philosophy professor from a distant university who wanted to interview Nathaniel, to study his mind as a psychological phenomenon. There was a genuine priest who tried unsuccessfully to reach some humanity into Nathaniel's soul. Jacob visited his brother one last time the week before his execution. They spoke briefly about childhood memories, rare moments when Nathaniel had seemed almost normal. Jacob asked if there was any message Nathaniel wanted to leave, anything he wanted to be remembered. Nathaniel thought carefully before answering. He told Jacob that the only message worth leaving was a warning. He explained that people like him existed, that they always had and always would. They were rare, but they were there, moving through society, hiding their true nature behind carefully constructed masks. The only defense was vigilance, not to trust blindly just because someone wore symbols of authority or piety. Healthy distrust, Nathaniel said, was the best protection against human predators. It was strange advice coming from someone about to be executed for horrific crimes, but there was a disturbing truth to it. Jacob left that final conversation feeling heavier than when he'd entered. He knew he would carry those words and all the memories of his brother until his own end. Newspapers continued to publish stories about the case. Some debated the nature of evil, questioning whether people like Nathaniel were the result of biology, nurture, or some mysterious combination of factors. Others focused on the victims, publishing detailed obituaries and celebrations of their cut-short lives. There were philosophical and religious debates about free will, moral responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. On the eve of the execution, a heavy snowstorm hit the mountains. It was as if nature itself were marking the moment with appropriate drama. Authorities worked through the night to ensure the gallows were properly prepared, that all legal procedures were in order. There would be no mistakes, no complications that could turn justice into a spectacle. Nathaniel spent his last night writing. He had asked for paper and ink and filled pages with reflections on his life, his actions, his understanding of himself. These were not confessions in the traditional sense, but clinical analyses of his own psychology. He wrote like a scientist documenting an experiment, even when the experiment was his own existence. These writings would eventually be studied by people trying to understand the human mind in its most extreme manifestations. When dawn finally arrived on February 13th, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear and brutally cold. It was the kind of morning where every breath hurt, where the world seemed frozen in stillness. People began gathering early, forming a silent crowd. There was no celebration in this gathering, only witness. History was reaching its inevitable end. The morning of February 13th dawned with a clarity that seemed cruel in its indifference. The sun reflected off the accumulated snow, creating an almost blinding brightness that contrasted with the solemnity of what was about to happen. The gallows had been erected in the courtyard behind the courthouse, a simple but solid structure built to precise specifications to ensure a swift and, as far as possible, humane execution. By 7 o'clock in the morning, a crowd of approximately 300 people had gathered. They were faces from all over the region, some who had lost loved ones, others who simply felt the need to witness the closing of that dark chapter. There was a respectful silence, broken only by the sound of boots crunching on packed snow and the occasional whisper between neighbors. It wasn't an atmosphere of celebration or revenge, but of heavy solemnity. Jacob Crowley was present, positioned discreetly in the back rows of the crowd. He had debated for days whether he should attend, whether he had the emotional strength to witness his brother's end. In the end, He decided he needed to be there. Someone from the family had to be present, someone to carry that final memory and honor in some strange way, both the perpetrator and the victims. Inside the prison, Nathaniel had been awakened before dawn. He had slept surprisingly well, according to the night guards. There were no nightmares, no visible signs of distress. He woke calmly, accepted the simple meal offered to him, and began preparing with the same methodical efficiency that characterized everything in his life. Sheriff Hendricks entered the cell around 8 o'clock. He informed Nathaniel it was time. Nathaniel simply nodded, finished adjusting his shirt and stood. He had requested not to wear the black cassock, saying it belonged to a performance he no longer needed to maintain. Instead, he wore simple, clean clothes, appropriate for an ordinary man facing his destiny. Before leaving the cell, Nathaniel asked for a moment. He walked to the small window that overlooked the distant mountains, now shimmering white in the morning sun. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, gazing out at the landscape that had been both his hunting ground and his refuge. His thoughts remained his own, indecipherable to any observer. The procession from the prison to the gallows was short, but charged with meaning. Nathaniel walked with firm steps without hesitation, flanked by guards on either side. His face maintained that characteristic neutral expression, but his eyes scanned everything, absorbing every detail as if cataloguing information down to the last possible moment. When he emerged into the courtyard and saw the waiting crowd, something almost imperceptible passed over his expression. Perhaps curiosity about how many people had come to witness his end. Judge Montgomery was present, as was protocol. He formally read the sentence again, his voice firm but without a trace of triumph. This wasn't a victory. It was simply justice being carried out as the law dictated. When he finished, he asked if Nathaniel had any final words. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and calm, carrying through the cold morning air with disturbing clarity. He said he would not apologize because it would be dishonest to feign feelings he did not possess, but he acknowledged that his actions had caused real suffering to real people and that society was right to remove him for reasons of collective protection. Then he said something unexpected. He thanked Jacob for doing what was necessary, for choosing principle over family loyalty. He said that in his own unique way, he respected that choice. And finally, he addressed the families of the victims present directly. He said he couldn't offer them what they truly wanted, genuine remorse and regret, but he could offer the truth. His actions weren't the fault of any victim, weren't provoked or justified by anything they did. The responsibility was entirely his and his flawed nature. They were strange words, devoid of real emotion, but there was something about their brutal honesty that brought a peculiar kind of closure. Nathaniel wasn't trying to redeem himself or seek last-minute sympathy. He was simply acknowledging the facts as he saw them. For some in the crowd, that was enough. For others, it would always be inadequate. The executioner, an experienced man brought in specifically to ensure the procedure was performed correctly, approached wearing the black hood. Nathaniel stared at the hood for a moment and then politely asked not to wear it. He said he wanted to see the sky until the very last moment. Sheriff Hendricks quickly consulted with Judge Montgomery, who agreed to the request. There was no legal reason to deny that final request. The rope was placed around Nathaniel's neck with professional care. The executioner checked the knot, adjusted the positioning, and made sure everything was exactly as it should be. Nathaniel remained motionless throughout the entire process, his eyes fixed on the bright blue sky above. If there was fear in him, it was buried so deeply that no outward expression betrayed it. Judge Montgomery gave the final signal. There was a moment suspended in time where everything seemed to freeze. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then the trapdoor opened with a sound of wood on wood that echoed through the silence of the courtyard. It was quick. The executioner had done his job well, calculating the weight and the fall precisely. Nathaniel Crowe died in a matter of seconds, his body swaying slightly in the cold mountain wind. There were no screams, no dramatic reaction from the crowd, just heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the wind through the nearby trees. Jacob closed his eyes at that moment. He couldn't bear to witness the final moment, but he remained there, standing in the snow, paying his last silent tribute to the brother he had once loved, before he fully understood what he was. Tears streamed down his face, not from simple sadness, but from something much more complex. It was grief for the loss of who his brother might have been if he had been born differently. It was relief that the suffering was finally over. It was guilt for feeling that relief. After 15 minutes, enough time to confirm that life had completely departed, the body was lowered. A simple pine coffin waited. Nathaniel Crowe would be buried in an unmarked area of the local cemetery, without a headstone, without an elaborate ceremony. His existence ended as it had been lived, isolated, disconnected, without genuine roots in any community. The crowd began to slowly disperse. People walked in small groups, talking in low tones. There was a sense of closure, but also of lingering unease. Witnessing an execution, even of someone unquestionably guilty of horrific crimes, left a mark on the soul. It was necessary. It was justice, but it wasn't something to celebrate. Catherine Hayes, Edwin's sister, stayed longer than most. She watched as the body was placed in the casket, as the guards began carrying the coffin to the cemetery. When she finally turned to leave, her face showed something close to peace. It wasn't happiness, but it was the end of years of uncertainty and searching for answers. Her brother was still lost, but at least now she knew the truth, and the man responsible had faced the consequences. Sarah Thornton was also present. She held a small locket that had belonged to her sister Margaret, clutching it to her heart as she watched the events unfold. She whispered words no one else could hear, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just final farewells to the sister who would never have a proper burial. When it was all over, she placed the locket back around her neck and walked back to her cart, ready to return to the life she needed to keep living. Samuel Patterson, the veteran who had survived, remained until the absolute end. He wanted to be sure it was truly over, that the man who had nearly taken his life would never again be a threat to anyone. When he finally left, he walked taller than he had in months. A weight had been lifted, not completely, but enough so that he could breathe a little easier. The days following Nathaniel Crowe's execution were marked by a strange stillness that settled over the Appalachian mountains. It was as if the entire region were exhaling a breath it had held for months. People returned to their routines, to their farms and businesses, but something had changed. There was a new awareness, an understanding that evil could wear any mask, even the most sacred. Jacob Crowley remained in Boone for 2 weeks after the execution. He visited the unmarked grave where his brother had been buried, only once. He stood there in the snow for half an hour, not praying, not crying, just existing in that space between memory and reality. When he finally left, he left a single stone on the freshly turned earth. It wasn't a memorial, exactly, but an acknowledgement. His brother had existed, had caused immense suffering, and now he was dead. That was all the story that needed to be told. Before leaving the area, Jacob sought out Sheriff Hendricks. The two men spoke at length about what they had witnessed, about the lessons that could be learned from that dark chapter. Hendricks confessed that the case had changed his view of human nature. He had always believed that all people had the capacity for goodness, if only given the right circumstances. Nathaniel had shattered that comfortable illusion. Some people, Hendricks discovered, simply lacked the internal mechanisms necessary for empathy and moral connection. Jacob agreed, but added something important. He said that acknowledging this reality didn't mean giving up on humanity as a whole. The vast majority of people were capable of kindness, compassion, and change. Nathaniel was a rare exception, not the rule. The danger lay in allowing extreme cases to destroy faith in humanity as a whole. The delicate balance lay in maintaining vigilance without falling into complete cynicism. Jacob left Boone in late February, returning to his secluded cabin in Tennessee. He would live another 18 years, always alone, always carrying the burden of being the brother of one of the most notorious criminals the mountains had ever known. He never married, never built a family of his own. Some said he feared he carried something of Nathaniel in his blood, something he might pass on. Others believed he simply couldn't imagine bringing new life into a world where people like his brother existed. Stories about Nathan Crowe spread far beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Journalists from distant cities published lengthy articles about the case, analyzing his methods, his peculiar psychology, and the flaws in the systems that allowed him to operate for so long. The case became a subject of study at universities, where philosophy and science professors debated nature versus nurture, free will versus biological determinism. Some of the writings Nathaniel left on his last night were eventually published, sparking intense controversy. Many argued that giving a voice to a murderer, even posthumously, glorified evil. Others argued that understanding minds like his was crucial to preventing future tragedies. The debate never reached a definitive conclusion, but the writings remained a disturbing document, of a consciousness fundamentally alienated from normal human experience. For the communities most directly affected, healing was slow and incomplete. Families who lost loved ones learned to live with absences that could never be fully explained or reconciled. Many bodies were never found. The mountains guarded their secrets too well, and Nathaniel had taken specific information to his grave, whether through genuine forgetfulness or a final act of control. Sarah Thornton eventually left the estate she had shared with her sister, Margaret. The memories were too heavy to bear alone. She moved to live with distant cousins but never truly recovered from the loss. She died just 6 years later in 1870, and those who knew her said she died of a broken heart, even though official records listed conventional medical causes. Catherine Hayes lived to a ripe old age, becoming a respected figure in her community. She often spoke of her brother Edwin, keeping his memory alive through stories of his kindness and generosity. She turned her grief into something constructive, working with travelers in need, and ensuring that no one in her area had to rely on strangers for lack of alternatives. It was her way of honoring Edwin and ensuring that his death had some meaning beyond tragedy. Samuel Patterson, the veteran who survived, lived for another 37 years after that terrible night. He married, had children, and built a life that defied the trauma he had experienced. But he never told his family the full story. He simply left instructions in his will that, after his death, they could read the official trial records if they wanted to fully understand what he had endured. He didn't want Nathaniel Crowe's evil to tarnish the happy years he had managed to build. The case also changed practical aspects of mountain life. Communities became more cautious about verifying the credentials of people who presented themselves as religious authority figures. Informal communication systems were established between villages, allowing warnings about suspicious strangers to spread more quickly. It wasn't universal distrust, but healthy caution. People learned that faith and kindness didn't require naivete. The black cassock Nathaniel had worn was eventually burned. Sheriff Hendricks personally oversaw its destruction, feeling that the object carried too much dark energy to be preserved, even as historical evidence. Some considered it superstition. Hendricks argued it was out of respect for the dead, a way of ensuring that no symbol of Nathaniel's crimes could become an object of morbid fascination. As the years passed, memories began to fade into the margins, as they always do. New generations grew up hearing stories about the false priest, but to them they were just stories, not lived realities. The Civil War ended, Reconstruction began, and new problems occupied people's attention. Nathaniel Crowe became a footnote in local history books, a grim reminder of a dark time. But looking back over the decades, we can see lessons that remain relevant. Nathan Crowe's story isn't just about a bad man doing bad things. It's about how human vulnerability can be exploited. It's about how symbols of authority and faith can be weaponized. It's about the importance of questioning, of maintaining critical awareness, even when we desperately want to believe. It's also about the limits of human understanding. We want stories to make sense, for villains to have motivations we can understand. But sometimes the truth is more disturbing. Sometimes people do horrible things, not for complex and tragic reasons, but simply because they are built differently, because they lack fundamental capacities that most of us take for granted. The Appalachian Mountains stand still, indifferent to the small human tragedies unfolding on their slopes. Mist still rises from the valleys on cold mornings, trails still wind through dense forests, and somewhere in those mountains there are caves and ravines that still hold secrets of lives lost more than a century and a half ago. Nature doesn't judge, it simply absorbs and moves on. Nathan Crowe was too evil for the history books, not because his crimes were unbelievable, but because they revealed truths about human nature that we prefer not to confront. It's more comfortable to think of monsters as obvious, easily identifiable aberrations. The truth is they can seem completely normal. They can carry Bibles and offer prayers. They can smile and use all the right words. And that's why their story still matters, still teaches us, still warns us. If you've made it this far with us on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in American history, thank you for your attention. Stories like this aren't easy to tell or hear, but they preserve important memories. If this content resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like so more people can learn about these forgotten stories. And in the comments, share your thoughts. Do you know of other disturbing stories from American history that deserve to be told? We're always looking for new chapters to explore together. Until next time, journey through the shadows of the past.